The furore surrounding Expropriation Act has caused a refocus on land ownership patterns in South Africa. While the act in itself does not directly address land reform, it's worth mentioning that the dispossession of land was a colonial and apartheid's greatest weapon to subjugate black Africans as second-class citizens in their motherland. So who owns which land in South Africa? Well, Samkele is here to explain and verify.
Indeed, Mfundo, the 1913 Natives Land Act saw thousands of black families forcefully removed from their land by colonial rulers and apartheid government. The act sought to ensure that blacks dispossessed people, as Saul Blackie put it, awakening on Friday morning, June 20, 1913. The South African native found himself not actually a slave, but a pariah in the land of his birth. Let's look at the 1913 Natives Land Act of 1913, which was used to contribute to the current land ownership patterns in South Africa. This is our very first slide. 1913 Natives Land Act. That preceded, before 1912, the formation of an organization that was meant to fight for land rights within the country that is currently battling in addressing this particular question, which is the African National Congress. Became law on the 19th of June 1913. Limited African land ownership to 7%. Limited African land ownership to 7%. Later to 13%, 1936, through Native Trust and Land Act, Mfundo. That was in that particular year of 1913 and 1936, when this act was amended in 1936 as to later bring black ownership to 13% through the Native Trust and Land Act, Mfundo.
Now, 30 years into our democracy, and it seems the impact of those this specific act is still felt in the skewed patterns of land ownership. Why is this still the case?
Indeed, Mfundo, the skewed partnership, the 1913 Natives Land Act was a powerful piece of legislation that became one of the cornerstones of the apartheid and paved the way for further legislations to deepen the restrictions of rights of black people and their ownership of land. Post-1994, the land reform process has been slow, expensive, underfunded by government, and in addition, poor governance. Let's look at the latest land ownership patterns within South Africa as per the audit of land in 2017, Mfundo. This speaks directly to the ANC's resolution, particularly on abandoning willing buyer, willing seller in 2017 and adopting this particular land expropriation without compensation, which led to land expropriation with nil compensation and ultimately to the Expropriation Act that we currently have right now. Land ownership, urban and rural areas. Individuals, they own 30.4% of land within urban and rural parts of the country. Trusts, which is a very sticky issue, particularly when it comes to farm ownership. Trusts own 24% of the land within urban and rural parts of the country. Companies, 19% own land within the country. That speaks directly to the economy of the country. Economic flows, ownership patterns of the economy of the country, particularly within the agricultural sector and land ownership. The trust issue, you only have the Ingonyama Trust, which administers a certain portion of land in the province of KwaZulu-Natal that is in the hands of the natives of that particular province. Community-based ownership, sitting at 2.9%. Co-ownership schemes, Mfundo, 0.7%.
You missed the state. The state, which is the big one, the 23%.
The state owns about 23% of the land. That will come in our next slide that we will look at, Mfundo, particularly when it comes to the ownership patterns of the land within the country, Mfundo. This will come in as individual ownership of total farms and agricultural holdings. That will equal, Mfundo, 37 million hectares of land within South Africa. When you look at the white community, they own about 26 million hectares of land. That amounts to 72% of the land within the country. The colored community, Mfundo, owns about 5.3 million hectares. That amounts to about 15%. The Indian community is sitting at 2 million hectares, 5%. of the land ownership within the country. Then the Africans, they own about 1.3 million hectares. That's 4% of the land within the country at this point in time. Then other land is 1.2 million hectares. That is 3%. Then co-owners is about 425,000 hectares. That is a mere 1% of the land ownership patterns within the country. But the state does own a huge chunk of land. But the question is that chunk of land for agricultural produce, or is that inhabitable land that cannot be used for agricultural produce, that not be used for agri-processing, that is inhabitable land as well, that is far-flung, and though there is no economic activity, particularly within that land. If you look at Gauteng as an example, Gauteng is got parts where it's largely agricultural land. When you go towards the East Rand in Ekurhuleni, you've got a number of farms within that particular belt of the province of Gauteng. You go to Sidibeng, Mfuleni, those areas in the Vaal, you've got sectors that are also used for agricultural land within those parts of the country, and also some parts of the land within Gauteng is used for mining. And that just tells you that there is land hunger in an economic hub of the country.
But
like
even beyond
Gauteng.
that, we still hear that they still need to do some sort of a land audit, because we're not 100% sure that 23% is actually what it should be. It's the correct figure. But beyond that, I think this is probably the most clearest picture we have gotten. It seems Africans are at the lowest end. 4% is honestly unbelievable, that you've got whites at 72% and Africans at 4%. This is probably the most simplest graph that should be shared with even Americans, the Donald Trumps, to see exactly how the land ownership patterns are in South Africa. But those who would be closely working with land ownership, what have been their views on all of this?
Mfundo, it would be rather interesting what AfriForum has to say to Donald Trump's delegation in the White House currently, particularly if they show the ownership patterns of land within the country, particularly when you look at the land ownership of the agricultural farms within the country. Mfundo, I'm going to bring in our expert at this point in time. I'll come back to this particular slide, especially to explain AfriForum. I'm going to bring in Mr. Terence Corrigan, who comes from the Institute of Race Relations, to further explain some of these points to us. A very good evening to you, sir.
And thank you very much for having me.
The ownership patterns within the country, can you just explain to us, particularly on the agricultural land, what's the percentage of ownership of the agricultural land that is within the various demographics of the country?
Okay, I would like to say that this is a very important issue, because I think it is being used to drive various narratives that are not entirely true. Now, that second graph you showed, the one with whites at 72%, I think it's very important to look at the hectareage that talks about, 37 million. That is, however, not the total land in the country, as you said. That is about 30% of South Africa's surface area. Why is this important? Because it speaks to the way in which people have historically and how people at the moment own land. Now, I get very concerned when I hear that figure: whites own 72%, black people own 4%, where that is presented as being a picture of South Africa as a whole. Because what that says, and you correctly pointed out the Land Act, it says that not only has the land to which African people have historically had access remained small, but it's actually declined from 13% to 4%. Now that is not true. The thing that I think that we need to understand is, and this is not to derogate the abuses of forced removals and conquest or whatever, but it is that African people in South Africa, and this goes back to the Land Acts, were invariably not permitted to own land as individuals. So in other words, you will find that virtually the entirety of South Africa's former homelands, KwaZulu, Gazankulu, whatever, that is all registered as state land. And very, very little has been done to alter that. So when you look at those figures, that is land to which African people have historically had access. The other thing, as you say, is trust. Very, very important. The way the big boys do it now is you don't tick you often do not own a farm in your own name. You own it through a family trust. And I've said this before. I can't say this for certain, but I would imagine that President Ramaphosa's farms are probably not classified as black land owned by individuals. They're probably held under trust. The other thing is that a lot of the transfers that have happened through land restitution and redistribution have not gone to individuals. Invariably, they go to communities, often through trusts or community property associations, or, and this is the case of redistribution, which I think is an area we don't talk about enough. This is for people who, let's say, you're an aspiring farmer, you don't have a historical claim on land, but you hope to get a piece to farm or to live on, or whatever. That goes through the redistribution program. That land is almost invariably retained as state land, so that is not then shown as being as being owned by someone other than the state. This all gets to the question of property rights. And I think it's very important to point this out. The Expropriation Act is not a land reform act, as you said. It is about property and the state's ability to take property. But what a lot of government policy has done with both urban and rural South Africa is that it has tried to provide a sort of asset, farmland or shelter in the form of a house, but not actual property, not actual ownership to the beneficiaries. And from my point of view, and from the point of view of the Institute of Race Relations, that's an absolutely key issue that we need to focus on.
When you look at the land ownership patterns, particularly, I want to stick on this issue of trust. Many people are starting to register these farms under these particular trusts. Who owns these particular trusts? Is it in the main the white community or the African community? Use President Ramaphosa as an example. He's but one of a few black South Africans of the elites who can afford to own a trust that owns farms. You look at Palapala, you look at Ndabanyoni. He is part of a few.
Look, okay, now this is one of these sort of open questions, and it's not something that the land reform, the land audit was able to. It didn't seem to provide any guidance on that. I imagine a lot of these are families. And look, just to be clear, I'm not saying as some people say on social media, well, trusts are something that there are no people behind them, or that proves that whites only own 20%. Yeah, look, I'm sure that some of these are owned by white families. I think that some of them could also be sort of commercial arrangements. There could be an element of foreign land holding. The point is, we just don't know for sure.
When you look at you as the Institute of Race Relations, AfriForum is currently on a trip gallivanting the world, particularly going to the United States of America. They'll go to Europe and other parts of the country if they deem fit to speak about the unjust racial laws that are being perpetuated within the country, particularly on the Expropriation Act. Do you think they've got these facts of land ownership patterns within the country?
Okay, look, I can't speak for AfriForum. We have certainly have some serious misgivings about the Expropriation Act. Look, I mean, if I could maybe rewind it a bit and say that I think that the danger in this legislation, which there's some various legal issues. A lot of it has to do with the definition of expropriation and what the state will recognize as an expropriation, as opposed to a deprivation or a custodial taking. I don't think that this is an issue that should be associated with race. So when President Trump said, the executive order about confiscating Afrikaners' farms or whatever. I think that is a danger that could befall, a large number of people. There was a case a couple of years ago, Mr. Becky Dlamini in Groundville, who discovered that his property, which I think was something like 3,000 hectares, which in KwaZulu-Natal is a huge piece of land. That's something else. Different parts of the country, you need different sized units. That had sort of been pulled out from under him by the local council. And I think worldwide experience actually shows that when you have a government that is not so good on the probity stakes, with powers to deprive people of their property, that the weight of that actually tends to fall on people at the bottom end of the scale. You think of what happens when there's a big sporting event and you need to clear people out to build a stadium. We saw that in China. We saw that in Brazil. I think there was actually an element of it here. But point is that I will fight till my last breath against trying to racialize this. I think that this is a question of property rights in the way South Africa's population accesses and is able to hold their property.
Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Corrigan. It is really an interesting debate, particularly with the current politics, global politics, and domestic politics currently at play. We'll be engaging you further as the Institute of Race Relations on this particular issue. Mfundo, just to look at our third slide, which speaks particularly to South Africa's vastness of land. Our third particular slide, which speaks to the land, the coastal lines of the country, how much land is within the hands of the state, Mfundo, and it just speaks to how, particularly when you look at Africans here, 1.3 million hectares, only 4% of that is within the hands of Africans. 4%, a decrease from 13 to 4%.
And he's not disputing it. When listening to your conversation with Terence, one thing he states that, yes, there is the 72% that is owned by white, and then black South Africans would be owning 4%. He says, but the concern here is that we're speaking about a surface area of 30%, that the figures nevertheless still stand, that even if we're talking about a surface area of 30% of South Africa's land, we're still stating that white South Africans would still own a significant portion of that 30% surface land area. Indeed,
Mfundo, that 30% of the entire surface landing of South Africa is largely in the main owned by white South Africans. Black South Africans, only a tiny few minority are able to own that particular commercial agricultural land. You own but a few, your President Cyril Ramaphosa's and your many of likes who have been within the business circles from the exile era, going into government, leaving government, going into business, whom are the owners of that particular land. A Joe from Umhlatuze will not be able to own that particular piece of land of that 30% due to the skewed economic relations that are there within the country.
Samkele, as always, thank you very much for explaining and verifying, and that's where we leave it for today's installment of Explain and Verify. More news on the other side of this break. Do stay with us.